Today's lecture, we'll be covering sound, how it's created, how it moves, and a little bit about how our auditory system processes it. We'll start with what has been called the dumbest philosophical question in the history of philosophical questions. If a tree falls in the forest and nothing is around to hear it, does it make a sound? I'll give you a second to answer that in your head. No doubt many of you answered yes, but the answer is not that simple. Sound is a vibration that propagates as a typically audible mechanical wave of pressure and displacement through a medium such as air or water. These waves are made up of two parts. A compression, which is an area of high pressure that forces particles of a medium closer together. And a rarefaction, which is an area of decreased pressure that forces particles of a medium further apart. While the falling tree does create vibrational energy that displaces molecules, transferring that energy through the air and forest, there's a little more to the story. The key part of this question is, and nothing is around to hear. In both physiology and psychology, sound specifically is the reception of these mechanical waves and the perception by the brain. Right now, all around you, there are pressure waves moving through the room or space that you're sitting in that will never be sound to us. This is because our ears are not designed to hear pressure waves below 20 Hz and above 20 K. This leads us to a brief overview of the ear. Our ability to hear is probably our most amazing sense for a variety of reasons, mostly for our ability to get an accurate assessment of everything auditory in our vicinity, including that which is behind us. Our sense of vision is powerful, but limited in that we can only see from our center of vision out to our periphery. Our sense of smell comes close. For instance, if someone were to pass gas close by, even if they were behind you, you would still be able to smell it. Fortunately for most, you would still not be able to localize where the smell was coming from, rendering blaming it on the dog a moot point. The ear is broken up into three parts. The first of these is the outer ear. As pressure waves hit our heads, the pinna gathers them and directs them into an opening called the concha. Then they travel down the auditory canal until they get to the tympanic membrane, which is also known as the eardrum. The tympanic membrane vibrates in response to these pressure changes. The membrane is so sensitive that it will respond to the tiniest vibration. Attached to the back of it is a tiny bone called the malleus. Whenever the eardrum moves, the malleus has to move as well, transferring that energy onto two more bones called the incus and stapes. The three of these bones are called the ossicles and are located in the middle ear. A fourth part can be found here, called the eustachian tube. Its primary purpose is to equalize pressure. If there's too much pressure on either side of the eardrum, it can't move efficiently and may end up causing damage. At this point, the vibrations move from air to the fluid of the inner ear, also known as the bony labyrinth. It is comprised of three sections: the semicircular canals, which are our primary means of balance, the vestibule, which is like the entryway to the inner ear, and the cochlea, which is our sound analyzing organ. Inside the cochlea is the basilar membrane. So the basics state that the vibration of the basilar membrane is responsible for us being able to hear. But it goes much deeper than that. The basilar membrane is set into motion by the pressure patterns, and different parts of the basilar membrane are responsive to different frequencies. The base of the membrane is thinner and more rigid and will respond to higher frequencies, and the apex or end of the basilar membrane is thicker, less rigid, and responds to lower frequencies. Here we see an image of a cross-section of basilar membrane and what it might look like if we were listening to a 3K tone. As that 3K pressure wave travels into our cochlea, the basilar membrane will be unaffected until that tone gets to the section of the basilar membrane that will respond to 3K and 3K alone. This brings us to the response of the auditory system. We'll start with something called equal loudness contours, which demonstrate the nonlinear function of the auditory system with regard to amplitude and frequency. Basically what this means is that we're not equally sensitive to all frequencies between 20 Hz and 20 K. Amplitude has something to say about that as well. The Fletcher-Munson curves were created in Bell Labs in 1933, and they demonstrate the nonlinearity of our ears, or that we do not hear all frequencies equally. Here we see 1K as being our reference. So if we follow this line up to the left, and were to listen to 100 Hz and 1K together, we would have to turn up 100 Hz to about 38 dB before they would sound as if they were equal amplitude. In 1956, two scientists named Robinson and Dadson decided to update these curves. Now, our auditory system did not improve between 1933 and 1956, but what did improve was our knowledge of the auditory system and the sensitivity of the equipment that was being used to test the subjects. So here we have some loudness examples that I'd like to do with you. We have 50 Hz, 1K, 8K, and 12K. I'm going to play these for you one at a time, and I want you to pay attention to how loud each one seems to you. Bear in mind that these are all played at the exact same amplitude. So here's 50 Hz, 1K, 8K, and 12K. Now, even though all of these were played back at the exact same amplitude, 1K should have sounded louder and fuller than the other three. 8K and 12K, while piercing, sounded like they were lower in amplitude than 1K. Now, we could apply this all in a working environment. Let's say we're mixing in a studio. It's important to remember that the most even response curve for human hearing lies between 85 and 90 dB, meaning that we're going to get the most accurate listening between 85 and 90 dB. It's important to try and stay as close to 85 as you can. At 85 dB, you can be exposed to that amplitude for 16 hours before suffering permanent hearing damage. At 90 dB SBL, however, you can only be exposed to that for 8 hours before suffering permanent hearing damage. When we get into pressure levels that are significantly higher than 90 dB, we arrive at something called the threshold of pain, which happens at around 120 dB SBL. It's at this point most people experience a tickling in their ear canal, as if someone is in there with a tiny feather moving it around. At a certain point, people will start experiencing actual pain, and that will increase as the pressure levels increase. This is going to be dependent on frequency, and it will also be dependent on the individual sensitivity of the listener. Sounds that we hear between 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz generally fall into two categories: periodic and aperiodic waves. Periodic waves have a repeated pattern, whereas aperiodic waves are random. They have no pattern. Here's an example of a periodic wave. Vibrating objects that make sound generally do so in a repetitive way that produce periodic waves. A couple of examples that could be periodic would be musical instruments, because of the repetitive nature of their vibrations. Engines can be considered periodic as well. Although next time you're woken up at 7 o'clock in the morning by a leaf blower outside your bedroom window, you might be able to argue against them sounding pleasant. On the opposite side of the coin, we have aperiodic waves, which are caused by anything that produces random particle displacement. Another example could be considered a car accident. We refer to random particle displacement as noise. I've also seen noise described as any audio signal that doesn't carry information, although this isn't quite true. If you were outside and that car accident happened close by, for instance, even if you weren't able to see it, you could still tell that a car accident happened because the noise that got to you carried information that your brain interpreted as a car accident, which means that all auditory signals carry information to the brain. Sometimes your brain just needs to know how to interpret that information to make sense of it, but the information is there if we need it. Noise generally comes in two categories, broadband and tonal. It can take on many forms, clicks, pops, hums, or any sound that is not intended to be part of a recording, for instance. It can be found in analog or digital equipment, tape hiss, and analog recording, quantization errors, 50 or 60 hertz hum, environmental noise, or extraneous noise from the sound field. One type of noise we may encounter in a sound field is source noise. This is any noise that occurs in or on an oscillating or vibrating object. If you're recording an acoustic guitar, for instance, the sound of the fingers sliding up and down the fretboard would be an example of source noise, or if the microphone captured the sound of clothes rustling as it was recording. This is also an example of source noise. If noise didn't carry any information, we wouldn't be able to discern from that recording that we could hear the keys being pressed on the instrument. We would never be able to figure out how to fix it. Another type of noise we might encounter is system noise. This is any noise generated by the system that a signal is traveling through. Some examples would be noise picked up by poorly insulated cables, in preamps, EQs, microphones, or any other piece of gear. This is what it might sound like. The type of noise that we might run into most often is environmental noise. This is noise that occurs in the environment that you're trying to make a recording. So if you're recording birds outside and there was a plane flying overhead, that would be an example of environmental noise. Or if you're trying to make a recording of a band in a club, the noise of the crowd would be environmental noise, and this is what it might sound like. While most noise is unwanted in a recording, there are types of noise that we can use to our advantage. An example of this is pink noise. Pink noise includes all frequencies playing at the same time from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, with an equal energy by octave. What this means is that from 20 Hz to 40 Hz, all of those frequencies are the exact same level. Then from 41 Hz to 80 Hz, those frequencies are the same level, but 3 dB lower. Then from 81 Hz to 160 Hz, those are the same level, but 3 dB lower than the octave below them. Pink noise is used for acoustic measurements and testing. So if you wanted to get a reading of your room, you would pump pink noise into it and then record it in the room so you can analyze the results. This is what pink noise sounds like. White noise is similar to pink noise in that all frequencies are represented from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. However, they have an equal energy by frequency, which means that all of the frequencies from 20 to 20K are at the same amplitude. White noise is used to test equipment and systems, and this is what it sounds like. This brings us to just noticeable difference. Now, a good mastering engineer would be able to hear an amplitude change of about 0.5 dB, but this is going to be frequency specific. In other words, if the change happened at 250 dB, he might not notice it, whereas if the change happened between 1 and 5K, they might notice it. I'm going to play for you an example of 200 Hz, and I'm going to increase the amplitude of that 200 Hz signal by 1 dB, and I want you to see if you can hear a difference between the two. Now, there's a good chance that you were not able to hear a difference between the two. In fact, as I played that example, I had a hard time hearing that the second example was indeed louder than the first example, and that has a lot to do with the frequency that I played. Our sensitivity to frequencies is greatest between 1 and 5K. So if we play two more examples, this time at 800 Hz, we might have an easier time hearing the difference between the two. I'm going to play 800 Hz at -18, then again at -17 dB. You might have also found that one difficult. We could keep increasing the frequency until we hear a difference, probably around 3K. The difference then would be incredibly noticeable. What we're going to do instead is try this with broadband noise. So we've taken white noise and we're going to decrease each section of white noise by 3 dB. And we should be able to tell the difference between each section very easily. So almost immediately we heard a drop as we went from the first section to the second section. Now we're going to make this a little bit more difficult. We're going to do this again, but in 1 dB increments. So I want you to pay attention to what change you hear a difference. At a certain point, it's going to sound like it's not the same signal as it was when it started. So a little bit harder to hear the difference between the first and second section of white noise. We're going to make it a little bit harder, and each section is going to be 3 dB lower than the section before it, 0.3 dB lower than the section before it. So that last example was 1 dB, this is 0.3 dB. This example was a lot more difficult to hear the difference between the first section to the second section, and so on. Our next example we're going to do for you involves music. This is more in line with what you guys are going to have to be doing in your homework. We're going to play you a piece of music, then I'm going to increase it by 2 dB and 5 dB, then 10 dB, so you can hear what each of these level changes sound like. If you ever have an issue noticing the difference in amplitude of music, don't listen to the clip as a whole, but listen to the individual pieces of that music. For instance, focus on a snare drum or a hi-hat or guitar, and see if you can notice the differences a little bit easier when you do that. So we're going to go ahead and give this a shot. This is the original clip. We're going to increase it by 2 dB, a little bit louder. This is going to be a 5 dB increase. And the last example we're going to do, we're going to increase it by 10 dB. This should be very noticeable. In that last example, the increase was so great that we started to experience something called clip distortion, where we started to lose little pieces of information as the top of the waveform was sheared off. Every system that you ever play music in has a limit, and if you reach that limit, you will experience a shearing off of the waveform and experience clip distortion. This is something you want to stay away from if you're ever recording a signal into a DAW or to tape. So we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to play the original broadcast news clip, and then we're going to decrease it by 2 dB, then 5 dB, then 10 dB. So you can hear what this sounds like. This is the original. We're going to reduce it by 2 dB. If the change wasn't as noticeable to you, then you should definitely be able to hear the 5 dB decrease. And this is what a 10 dB decrease sounds like. So that concludes the first lecture. I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard today and seen today and experienced today. We'll have the second lecture available to you in a little bit. We hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Take care. Bye.